Hi everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. We are right on 9 a.m. Geneva time here. I can still hear a few beeps as people are still joining. So if I can beg your patience, I think we'll give maybe another just 30 seconds or 1 minute. But in the interim, perhaps I can start the welcome and introductions. So I am pleased to welcome all of you to the second module of the Interagency Training on Disability Inclusion in the 2021 Humanitarian Program Cycle. My name is Kimberly Leitz, and I work with the Assessment, Planning, and Monitoring branch in OCHA Geneva, and I will serve as your moderator today. I have had the extremely good fortune to work with colleagues from UNICEF, UNHCR, WFP, and IOM with expertise on this topic who have developed the content and format of this training. Our facilitators today will be Ahmed Ghanem and Steve Perry from UNICEF. We have had an overwhelming response to this training, well beyond what was originally expected. And we had more than 160 people engaged in the first module. As a result, we have divided the second module, as I'm sure you're aware from the emails, into three separate options. In this manner, we were able to hopefully be more convenient for different time zones. And if my memory serves, this one was targeting the Asia Pacific region. That doesn't mean you have to be based in the Asia Pacific, but we did choose a time that was more likely to fall within working hours for those there. So we have a short 90 minutes with you today, and we kindly ask for your patience if we do run a few minutes long. Although our group is large, we will try to keep these sessions lively and interactive. We will be monitoring the chat space, so please, if you have a question or suggestion, do share with the group. We will dedicate specific time for Q&A, and we will be looking at these questions. So please note that. If we're unable to answer something today, we will, without question, ensure that there's follow-up. So those answers are provided later. The session will be recorded, and the cloud link will be posted following the session. Allow me to note that CART transcription is available, and the link to that will be posted in the chat. And the presentation has been developed in a manner so that it is also accessible. So for those of you who aren't aware, CART is an assistive tool that helps people who are hard of hearing follow a presentation. So CART is also something that's called a reasonable accommodation, and we consider it a best practice for meetings. Thanks to all of you who took the 10-minute pre-test quiz on SurveyMonkey. There will be a post-session follow-up quiz in order to try to assess the success of this training. And we will ask you to complete a short session feedback at the end of today. So today, as many of you are aware, during the first module, our focus was on understanding the key definitions related to disability work, where it sits within the humanitarian program cycle. For those of you who were not with us during the first module, you would benefit, if you have not already, from going through the guidance that was developed last year, as well as watching the recorded session of the first module. Today, however, we're going to shift to more practical application, starting with a presentation of the practical issues of what disability inclusion should look like in the humanitarian program cycle, followed by some mini case studies which aim to provide insight into addressing the challenges associated with making this a reality. With that, if my colleague Ahmed is ready, I will pass over to him. Ahmed?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I see that there are a lot of colleagues that is coming. Thank you, Kim, for the introduction. I think that it's today session will be around, we will have 3 parts. The first part, we will discuss about the practical step-by-step following how we can include disability inclusion in HNO HRP. We will follow the structure of HNO HRP. So we will see in each section of HNO HRP how we include disability. Then the second part, it will be a scenario-based discussion. We will have a practical scenario that is happening in reality in order to cover two important topics. And then at the last, we will have plenty of time for question and answer and discussion around us to check with you what is the most practical and challenging issue in disability inclusion in both HNO and HRP. Starting, actually, we will start with disability inclusion in HNO, and we will follow as we see the section of HNO document. We will discuss the summary of humanitarian needs and key finding, how disability inclusion could be embedded in this section. Also, we will discuss the other 4 parts of the HNO, either impact of crisis, risk analysis, monitoring of situation and need, and then the sectoral analysis. And we will see also how disability inclusion should be embedded in the last session. So you will have an idea by the end of this session how you can evaluate your document if you have it in draft now, or you will have it, you are currently drafting it, how you will evaluate it and see to which extent it's inclusive for disability topic. Actually, if we started with the summary of key finding and see what is actually should be existing as a disability in the key finding in the summary, this section is very important of HNO. Actually, it's to summarize what is the humanitarian needs, what is the key finding, and this is the most important section because it's the starting. It shows the direction of this document and the country regarding what will be done in humanitarian and what we have seen and find. So it's very important at this stage to have the key finding disaggregated, all the total number of PEN by disability or person in need by disability. Of course, we have also gender and age. This is a very important disaggregation because without this disaggregation, it will be very difficult to understand what is the needs of person with disability. Also, we need to have more, not only the quantitative number of persons with disability, also the qualitative data. What kind of concern, priorities of persons with disability this is very important. Sometimes, and most of the time, we have seen the last year that the HNO is focusing on the numbers of persons with disability or how they disaggregated Ben by disability, but actually as equal important is to understand the concern and priority of these persons with disability. Also, in the part of the humanitarian consequence, we need to describe the specific or the risk that is faced by subgroups of population due to disability. We need to understand that, and we discuss it in more detail last. Sorry, I have here that the presentation is not moving. I will check what is the problem. I will try to share it again. Could you see it now?
Yes, we can, Ahmed.
Yes, it's in summary of humanitarian needs, key funding.
That's correct.
Great, thank you. I was talking in the previous slide about how we will go through the section by section of HNO to see by the end, because in the last discussion we was already covering how we can include disability. Now we want to show you what is the situation, what is the shape of disability inclusion inside the document itself. So as we said, the key finding, the disaggregation, understand the concern and the priorities of person with disability. And then in humanitarian consequence, it's very important to describe what is the heightened risk faced by subgroups of population due to disability. For example, women with disability, children with disability. We need to understand to which extent every subgroup have an increased risk due to disability and how disability is interacting, as we will see in the coming slides. Also, we need to understand what is the capacity and the coping mechanism person with disability is using. It's very important not to focus only on the negative side. Most of the time in humanitarian consequence, other subgroups or groups find their own capacities and coping mechanism to cope with the humanitarian situation. And sometimes this coping mechanism is negative, sometimes it's positive, and person with disability in most of the time and their family have their own coping mechanism. Understanding this coping mechanism is very important. So moving to the second part one, which is the impact of the crisis on the humanitarian condition. Actually, we have four parts on this in this section. We have the context of the crisis, and we will ask you to have at least 3 criteria in this part. In the context of a crisis, when we, in the HNO document, the humanitarian need overview document, we need to describe what is the key problems face person with disability, also the other subgroup, how the crisis is impacting person with disability different, what kind of coping mechanism, as we said, they are using, what kind of factor contributing to increase the risk for person with disability, and what kind of priority and needs from their perspective. So as you see in the context of the crisis, we are trying to analyze how the person with disability as a subgroup is interacting with the crisis in different way. Then in humanitarian consequence and what is the causal factors, that is usually a basic part of HNO, we need to understand and identify person with disability as a subgroup. Person with disability in most of the time, in most of the country have more like from 15 to until 25 in some percent of the population in some countries. So we need to understand how these subgroups and to identify them. And then we need to reflect diversity and of this subgroup. So one of the basic way of reflect this reflect diversity and intersectionality is to understand how the 3 factors is interacting together. So the first one is disability related factor. We need to understand to which extent the barrier that is faced by person with disability is interacting with contextual factor that is related to the crisis itself, and structure inequality, the age and sex and the gender, ethnicity, religion. So sometimes, for example, if I give example for such an analysis in practical, personal based, if we have seen a woman with disability, usually they have, she may face some physical barriers to move from one place to other or to access services or whatever. And then this could be increased by the context of the crisis. For example, the crisis have led to lack of access to fresh water or other factor. And then how the fact that she is woman, actually, its gender is affecting this inequality. So how these factors interacting together is usually give us the reflection of diversity and intersectionality, and also help us to prioritize population group. For example, we can prioritize women with disability, a displaced person with disability. We can use this as a one way to do the prioritization. Then we go to the severity of humanitarian needs, and in this case, we need to understand what is the impact of disability-related factor in the humanitarian consequence and need. And usually, as you see from the analysis, this is how we are using it, by see how the disability factor is interacting with other factor. And then, of course, is this part, it's very important to highlight the number of person in need with disability and give them some visual representation. It's one of the biggest, and we will discuss that, how we will do that in practice in our scenario based, because this is one of the most challenge issue usually to choose what is the how we disaggregate the bin number. So moving to the other section, or to estimate the bin of a person with disability, it's of course, it's usually in most of the situation, if you will collect a primary data, if you plan to collect a primary data, ensure that you are using some sort of international recognized method like Washington Group set of tools to disaggregate the primary data by disability. So this is very important. We are talking about, because we know the situation of COVID, we will discuss that at the end in the case scenario based, but if you will have a primary data, you can plan from the beginning to include a very simple Washington Group set of tools to ensure that your data will be disaggregated, at least as all the international criteria and the international standard, quality standard is say, we need to have a disaggregated data by age, gender, and disability. This is very important. So if we don't have a primary data collection planned in general in the country, which is very rare, and we will depend on secondary data source, we need to ensure that we have a reliable evidence-based estimation. We need to assess to which extent the secondary data is reliable, for example, using administrative data or national prevalence rate. We need to understand if the secondary data is not reliable. So in this case, we don't have primary data, we don't have secondary data. We will use the global estimation in this case, which is 15%. Then we will see to which extent we will understand this estimation based on the group. But you should remember that in most of the time, the humanitarian context, the number of persons with disability is much higher than 15%. Yes, 15% is a global estimation by WHO and the World Bank, but most of the time it's much higher than that in humanitarian context. Then we have part 2 and part 3. In part 2 of it, in humanitarian need overview, which is part, for whom who have not been attending our first module, HNO is always part of the humanitarian program cycle. And humanitarian need overview, we need to have in part 2 the risk analysis. And in this case, you need to reflect to which extent the broad risk context facing by persons with disability. And in this case, we will strongly advise that we can have a perspective of this person with disability organization or local and international NGO working with persons with disability to understand the risk and barriers. Most of the time, this organization, because of their either they are representing persons with disability or they have a close link with persons with disability, they understand the risk and barriers. And also they have some sort of understanding what kind of protection concern that persons with disability could face. And in this case, it will be very easy for you to analyze the risk analysis in relation to disability. In part 3, which is monitoring and situation and needs, we need also to identify humanitarian consequence and, as you say, how it evolve with persons with disability, also how they access assistance and access services. And also we need to ensure that we are consulting with persons with disability. There are a huge important criteria, quality criteria, nothing about us without us. It's very important if you will do work for persons with disability and around persons with disability, you need to consult with them, not only because we are having the accountability for affected population and they should be included in that, but also because most of the time they have a lot of information that could be very useful for the monitoring and situation needs. The last part is sectorial analysis, and usually in sectorial analysis we have different sectors, and every sector have put his own risk and what is the risk that is faced, and we need to ensure that we are describing in very practical way how the crisis is impact differently persons with disability and what kind of factor contributing to this risk. I will give some example. You see, as you see in the presentation. For example, last year we have seen some HNO, humanitarian need overview, right? For example, persons with disability are more exposed to in situation of insecurity, or for example, persons with disability experience high impact of food shortage. This kind of description of risk most of the time is not useful because it's not very clear what is the problem? It's only saying that person with disability is vulnerable. And if you try to build an interaction or an intervention based on that, you will not be able to do that. Comparing to, for example, if we said instead of, for example, that persons with disability are more exposed in situation of security, we can say that in situation of security, persons with disability are heightened risk of experience violence due to their difficulty in feeling to safe area or feeling to safe area or move to safe area. So in here, we are not only identifying the risk situation, but also identify what kind of factors that is increasing this risk. For example, here that inability of them to move to safe area. And I will not go, of course, for every example, but this is giving idea about it's not only important to identify the risk. You need to identify the risk and the cause or factors that leading to this risk in order in the future to be able to use this information usefully. Then we have the HNO annex, which is actually the last part of the, usually the last part of the HNO. And in this, we are actually should reflect on additional information is needed. If you are unable to identify all the information in your HNO and you know that there are an information gap related to disability, you should acknowledge that in your annex. It's very important to do that in order in the future to be able to plan to fill this information gap. Also, if you don't see that there are some sort of reliable data on persons with disability in this country, you should acknowledge that and you should plan to have a need assessment and other data collection process in the future. If disability cannot be integrated on plan need assessment, consider also having a primary data collection exercise in the future in the planning, and this is very important in the information gap. And of course, you need to ensure that you reference to local disability actor in order to help the working in localization with the local disability actors in the HRP part. So this is more or less the very fast way how you can see disability inside the document as a structure. I will move back again to my colleague Steve, who will cover the HRP, which is humanitarian response plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. I appreciate that. And Ahmed, I'm calling on you as we go through this presentation to push down the slides. So my job in a short amount of time is to walk everyone through where disability fits into the humanitarian response plans. The first point I'd like to make is that the intent here, as Ahmed emphasized, isn't to be duplicative in any way. What we tried to do with this guidance is make it sync very closely with what the Interagency Steering Committee Humanitarian Program Cycle Guidance does in its step-by-step approach to working through the HRP. What we've tried to do is to make it follow very closely the template that's provided. Ahmed, do you want to go down one slide? Thanks. So the template, consists of a number of sections. What I'll do in this presentation is to quickly go through each of these sections to show you where disability can fit into each one of them. If you go down the next slide. Thanks. So right at the front, I think our job is to sort of help the humanitarian team as they develop the HRP to put disability up front, even in the executive summary section, as it were, of the HRP. It's important to recognize that persons with disabilities exist in these contexts. So it's appropriate, I'd say, to get the humanitarian coordinator to include in their reference something about how the plan is inclusive. Right at the top level, as we talk about the response plan at a glance, it's appropriate to sort of urge the humanitarian country team to sort of think about sort of referencing somehow that there is this not insignificant population, 15% of the population that are disabled, and that they also are in this crisis and need to be considered. Do you want to go down one slide? Ahmed? Thanks. So what we would urge is that the key outcome of a HRP, any HRP, is to be inclusive as possible, and somehow expressing the idea that persons with disabilities, among other groups, also need to be included in the thinking. What we would wish to do in the planning process is to avoid generalities. Ahmed captured this well in an earlier point. Often what we've seen in the past is that we talk about vulnerable groups, and where we find disability reflected is in a paragraph, a bracket where a lot of different vulnerable groups are listed, and disabilities is also there. What we would like to move humanitarian country teams towards is a little bit further analysis of what makes persons with disabilities different in the context, to describe how the crisis impacts persons with disabilities in a different way, talking about the barriers and risks that they face. What we saw last year is that stronger HRPs, humanitarian response plans, somehow in this front part pulled out the issue of persons with disabilities as a kind of text box, and that allowed the team to get into a little bit more detail about what was different about persons with disabilities and other subgroups. If you go down one slide. What's important, we reviewed last year's humanitarian program cycle documents, and what we found is that very often at the analysis stage, quite a good job was done in terms of identifying risks and barriers and what the particular issues were with persons with disabilities. What's really important to do in the planning stage is to pull that good needs assessment work that is done and pull it forward into the planning. What we can talk about is the impacts of social exclusion on persons with disabilities, the particular obstacles that persons with disabilities face, and what the unmet needs are specific to persons with disabilities, particularly heightened risks of violence and abuse. I mean, there's a lot of background research that shows that persons with disabilities are particularly higher risk in terms of violence and abuse. And recognizing that at the planning stage, I think, is important. Ahmed, if you can go down one slide. It's important to link strategic objectives back to persons with disabilities as well. What we found in the review of last year's response plans is that the good work that was happening at the needs assessment stage didn't necessarily translate forward into the planning stage. So it's important to link the strategic objectives also back to persons with disabilities. We're showing on this slide an example from the Somalia HRP from last year. And what you can see is that they've explicitly embedded disability into one of their strategic objectives. They've quantified what the size of the problem was. They've talked about specifically what they would like their strategic objective to do. And so it's a useful best practice to consider doing that in HRPs moving forward. Ahmed, you want to go forward? Thanks. So what to do and what not to do. The no is pretty simple. Don't just list persons with disabilities in a long list in a bracket of all the targeted groups, people with vulnerabilities. Better to describe how the response will directly contribute to the vulnerabilities of persons with disabilities. Good to think about how your response will both mainstream these activities across all clusters and sectors, as well as whether there are particular targeted interventions. Yes, also, please review the responses as you develop them to make sure that persons with disabilities within all activities have adequate access, if there are specific barriers that they're addressed, and that adjustments are made to implementation so that persons with disabilities can fully benefit. In terms of monitoring and accountability, a best practice is to as well take a twin track approach to disaggregate persons with disabilities that benefit in other areas like education or health. How many, as we disaggregate men and women, boys and girls, also disaggregate persons with disabilities. And also to include indicators where appropriate that indicate where you are targeting specific activities towards persons with disabilities. Do you want to go down? In part 4, sectoral objectives and responses, what we would like to see is that references to disabilities are seen across the entire document and not sort of embedded in one particular sector or cluster. So the response to persons with disabilities isn't just a protection issue. It isn't just a health issue or an education issue. It's something that each of the clusters needs to consider and address as they think through what the response will be. Do you want to move to the next to last slide? So in terms of the HRPs annexes, there's a few important things to keep in mind. As the clusters and sectors develop their specific plan, it's important to reflect persons with disabilities in this results framework. Again, when we were reviewing last year's work, this was an area where something happened. Good analysis, even good description at the planning stage wasn't necessarily reflected at the results framework stage. As cross-cutting and specific activities are identified, it's important to ensure that some thinking goes into the budgeting for inclusion and quality. There would be extra costs, we imagine, in terms of training or adaptation of processes. So urging clusters to sort of think through what's different in terms of including persons with disabilities into the response, that will have a budget implication. And finally, the back page of the HRP is usually a section where it talks directly to donors to say, what if we fail to respond? And I think here in this last section of the HRP, it's really important to highlight the impact of persons with disabilities and sort of if the response isn't fully funded, the implications and impacts on them. If you go to the last slide. So don't forget, this guidance that was prepared was meant to sync pretty closely with the other guidance that helps inform your humanitarian response planning. It's really important, and this is what we learned from last year, to pull forward whatever has happened at the needs assessment stage and to try to reflect that in each of the clusters and sectors that are addressed by the plan. And it's important once you make this plan to sort of look at the rest of the humanitarian program cycle and say, okay, the plan is now made. It's now going to be translated into action, and to use this as a solid basis for program design and implementation. So thanks for that. I think we have a deeper discussion in a minute now.
Thanks a lot for that, Steve and Ahmed. There were some very interesting pieces of information there. I'm not seeing any questions currently coming through on the chat, so I'm going to just put a quick reminder to encourage individuals to please post questions if they arise. Just a few that came through on some of the acronyms. Fair enough. We do tend to get embroiled in our acronyms here now, don't we? So based on the information that Ahmed and Steve have conveyed, we're going to look towards the second part of this webinar, where we look at some scenarios which reflect some real life challenges that have been encountered within our country offices, the country operations, excuse me, that we have learned about through the lessons learned review, which was undertaken by the interagency group associated with the different payment by results with a focus on disability inclusion. So what we're looking at would be some two different scenarios where we will be looking at strengthening the collection and analysis of data on persons with disabilities, and also the involvement of organizations focused on persons with disabilities. What we'll do is share an online form with you where participants will choose one of the options. And then the facilitators will come in and comment on these options and discuss with you how we might address these different challenges. Sorry, I'm just seeing something coming up on the chat. I'm sorry. As we noted, Martin, yes, we will be looking at practical examples. That's the next phase that we go to just right now. So with that, I am going to hand back over to my colleagues who have just put scenario 1 up in front of you. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Steve. Actually, we will have a small case study. We will focus on strengths in collection and analysis of data in disability, Lithuania, HNO, HRP, which is, of course, a fictional country. What we will do is in this exercise, we will explain what is the situation, what is the context, what is the challenge, and then we will ask you to choose one of 3 options, as you will see. So without further delay, we will start actually, as we say, it's a fictional country. It have some sort of positive direction toward peace and stability after many years of conflict. However, in this country, there are some recurrence of climatic shock, some environmental and climate problems and crises that is affecting, and of course some conflict pocket in the country itself that is in creating some insecure environment, and of course a different internal displacement inside the country itself. Also, the situation of political and socio-economic is unstable to some extent, of course, after COVID-19 pandemic. This creation or this problem have created some complex environment for persons with disability where they're facing additional barriers and risk, and most of the time they are excluded from humanitarian assistance. Even if there are some humanitarian assistance, most of the time they are excluded. And there are some, of course, stigma, social exclusion, discrimination. And of course, giving all these factors that we have discussed, the extreme level of poverty, especially for persons with disability, it was very important for the team that is working in humanitarian planning in this country to identify persons with disability and to ensure that this identification is based on data and evidence rather than just perception about what is the situation. So without delay, the humanitarian coordinator has committed to strengthen information on disability during HBC, the cycle that is happening now, 2021. And of course, this is also have considered the effect of COVID-19 on our planning in humanitarian response. So what you need to do, or what is the challenge that you have, we ask you to support the humanitarian country team, the team that is working to take a decision. Now they are thinking about a big decision. Yes, they understand that the quality humanitarian response is built on understanding of the requirement and priorities of persons with disability during the crisis, but they don't have a clue about what is the priorities and the requirement of persons with disability. They wanted to ensure that they are having accurate and meaningful information and data about disability during working in their humanitarian need overview process. So could you support them? What I will ask you to do is that you will access this link in the chat. I will send it now. 1 second, sorry. Please access it through web, any web or mobile. It's a Google form. And in this, you will find the same description, the text that I have seen, and the same description that I was describing now. And you will given the same challenge, and then you will have to choose between 3 options. Option 1, option 2, and option 3. Choose one and click next. And then you will have to see the consequence of your option. So you will have, when you choose one option, you will automatically you will see what is the consequence, what will happen if we apply this option. And in this case, you have two scenarios: either to go back and because you feel that you was not right in your option, so you to re-choose again another option, or you are convinced that you choose the best option. So just if you wanted to write any comment, or and if not, it's optional, and write submit and click submit. Okay, if everyone is clear, can you access it, please? If you can send in if you have a problem, send in the chat. I want to give you scenario 1. Yes, share. So as you see now, I think you see the scenario. You have 3 options. Kim and Steve, is the scenario is clear on the screen?
It is clear, Ahmed.
Yes, yes. So you have to choose one of these options, the 3 options, and here, and just click next to see what is the option. And then after you click that, you will be able to see what is the consequence of your choice. Read the 3 options carefully and choose, please. We will give you 5 minutes to choose and reread. We have 7 responses until now. Take your time if you feel that you need to back to another option to check.
Hey, Ahmed, I'll say I'm very interested to see if people are more interested or have a keener interest in
Yes.
in how to look at this through the lens of collecting primary data, collecting new or additional data, or whether or not there's greater interest in seeing how to maximize existing data, or looking through secondary data to identify what additional insights might be obtained specific to persons with disabilities. Particularly in light of our, our current situation, our new normal, where primary data collection can be somewhat more challenging and new approaches are having to be explored. I'll admit I'm quite interested to see what the group is most interested in learning or exploring through this first scenario.
Yes, exactly, Kim. Thank you for your comment. It's very important to know that in this situation, we have to see that sometimes it's not clear which option, and there are no right and wrong in our plan. But it's very important to understand when I choose one option, there will be a consequence, especially when it's come to data, and we will discuss that in a minute. Online ruling level, sorry. I will show you in very quick way because I have now like 25 response. So I will show you also how you choose when you are, okay. Yes, this one, share. Okay, if for example, if I choose option 1, or option 2, for example, because the situation, then we choose. You will see, if you see the screen now, you will see the answer, what is the consequence, and then you can hide. If you think that you have chosen a right one or right choice, you can write any option right here, or you think that after you read this consequence, you think that it's not the best scenario, you go back and choose another one until you reach to the best scenario in your, and then you can click submit. Okay, just for clearance, I will back to our, okay. So I think that because of the time, we have several response now, nearly 33 response. I will ask you to back to me so we can discuss this response. And of course, as you see, there are no wrong and right answer. As a summary of what you have done, or what you have, as you see from the screen now. I'm sorry, I cannot see the screen. So is it clear, the pie chart?
It is clear, and we do see an overwhelming preference for option 1 on the primary
Exactly.
data collection. Very interesting.
Exactly. Yes, I'm very happy of this question or this answer, option 1, primary data collection. And we have also some colleagues that have chosen option 2, and some colleagues who have chosen option 3. If you have seen the discussion itself and you see how it's going, actually there are no right and wrong option in this case. Actually, if we are depending on primary data collection, we know that there are some data will be already collected, primary data. We know that the GMNCA will be collected, that there we have the protection reporting, we have an education reporting, and the only thing that we need to do is just including the 5 questions of Washington group inside this to enable to have some sort of meaningful disaggregated data. Of course, will need that we will have information that needed by the country. We will have understanding of all the data that we have disaggregated by disability. But one of the big problems that we are always facing in this choice is that we will need some human and financial resource to strengthen data collection. We need some expertise in how to include and analyze Washington group question inside these tools, and we need some also maybe some financial resources to do that, although it's not very big. So that's why I think it's very good to see that at least 70% of the group have chosen this choice. And then we have chosen one. We will choose the disability secondary data. We will not collect new data. This option, I will advise you to follow, only to follow if you don't have the primary option, the primary data collection. If you have in the countries that will not do a primary data collection, which is very rare, okay, of course, you will search on the second best option, which is the secondary data. But be careful because most of the time the secondary data, as you see in the consequence, are not reliable. Most of the time we don't have data, most of the time it's not reliable. But you will find in our guideline, we will post in, we posted last seminar, but we can post it this one. You will see a very, very comprehensive table about what kind of second data you are searching for and where to find it regarding disability. And in this case, you need to understand that most of the time you will not have the most accurate data, but at least you will have some data. In option 3, you cannot find secondary data. You will not do primary data collection, and then you will depend on the worldwide estimation about disability. Unfortunately, that we have seen in last year, as Steve said, a lot of countries is doing that, depending on the 15%. Actually, you don't have any resources, as you see, you need only a calculator, which in some cases is not fair enough, because most of the time you are not having an accurate estimation about what is going on. You don't have an understanding because country is different to each other. The estimation is global estimation without clear reflection on what is the current needs, view, priorities of person with disability. So I will advise strongly when we are going through that to have a mix between the 3 options. You need to understand what kind of data you need to find in disability, and you need to decide some data we will find it in through primary data collection. Some data will be only exist through secondary data analysis, and in some very rare cases you will not find any data, so you will have to use estimation. But even in this case, we will strongly advise you to have a discussion with organization of person with disability and the person with disability to understand their needs, priorities. It's not numbers, it's more like a descriptive, qualitative analysis to understand what is the situation. Do you have any comment? If anyone have any comment on that? Anyway, we will have an opportunity for question and answer at the end. I will encourage you to keep sending your question inside the for our chat, and when we will reach to this part, we will discuss all the questions. I will move to my colleague Steve for the second slide, or the second test.
Thank you, Ahmed. Really good on the first scenario. Let's see if we can do as good a job on the second one. So again, we're back to Ruritania, sort of a fictional country. Its situation has changed a bit. This Ruritania in this scenario is, you know, in the midst of a big, complex, protracted crisis, and it's got large numbers of IDPs. And this situation has been going on for years and decades. Because of this ongoing war, a large proportion of the population are affected by disability in one way or another. And this is a really high priority issue for both the people, but also the humanitarian responders, of course, but also the government that also sees this issue of disability as a really high priority one. Do you want to move to the next slide? So in Ruritania too, this protracted crisis that we're talking about, what's happened over the last decades is that the emergence of a few strong and articulate local organizations of persons with disabilities, this is another acronym, the OPDs, has taken place. So that there are some local organizations that have stepped forward and begun to address the issue of disability in a focused way. As well, you know, given the decades that this crisis has been continuing, there's a large number of other INGOs, international NGOs, as well as the Red Crescent, Red Cross, who also prioritize programming responding to the needs of persons with disabilities. So you've got this local community of organizations focused on disability, and you have an international community that's also interested in this. So As in many humanitarian contexts, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the architecture of how we're responding to the problem in Ruritania 2 is a bit complex. We have a two-tiered situation in Ruritania 2. We have a humanitarian country team that has the humanitarian coordinator and the heads of UN agencies and some donors and some selected NGOs. And this HCT makes the big decisions. They're sort of setting sort of broad policy. They're the ones that release the HRP ultimately. They're the ones whose name is sort of on the response. They're the ones going out to donors to try to raise resources for it. But where some of the real work gets done is sort of one step below that on the inter-cluster coordination team, which is a bit more technical, and it involves the cluster coordinators and INGOs as co-leads. And this is where the planning actually takes place and where some of the deepest analysis occurs. You want to go to the next? So can you help support the Ruritania HCT to sort of take a decision on this? What we would really like to do is to ensure more effective humanitarian coordination. And we'd like to get more participation in the process by organizations of persons with disabilities. We want them more involved in the process. We would like to hear their voices. We would like to see them engaged. So there's a number of ways that we could go on that, and that's the subject of our next scenario, self-assessment. So I see, Ahmed, you've put in the chat box a link to this form. And as you did with Ahmed's scenario, what I'd like you to do is to sort of read the background and read the three options that are offered in terms of what the HC could do to increase the voice of persons with disabilities in the process. There's three options that are provided. As Ahmed said, click an option, see what some of the consequences are, click back, look at all of the three options, and then at the end of the few minutes that we'll give you, click on the one that you think is the best approach. Is this the actual one, Ahmed? Option one is to establish a permanent seat on the HCT for a local organization of persons with disabilities representative. Option two is to encourage relevant clusters, for example, the health cluster, the protection cluster, and so on, to build stronger relationships with organizations of persons with disabilities. And option three is to identify potential organizations of persons with disabilities and invest in their longer term capacity strengthening. So as you found with Ahmed's scenario, there's no right or wrong answer. There's consequences to any way you go, and so it'd be interesting to see how you come out on this. So read all of the three consequences. There might be other consequences as well. I mean, there's every context is different, and then finally select the one that you feel is sort of best represented. I think what you've done, Ahmed, here is you've looked at option one. Option one is to giving an OPD a permanent seat at the table. And yes, there's some notes here about what the possible consequences of that are. Of course, a higher profile for disability issues. You push forward issues like reasonable accommodation. How does this organization even get into the UN office? How is it possible for OPDs to participate? There's also risks and so on. So go through each of the options and finally settle on one. Let's give you about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll come back.
Well, we're definitely seeing a preference emerging from this scenario as well. Steve, I'm intrigued by the language in option 2, where it says encourage relevant clusters, such as health and protection, to build stronger relationships with local OPDs. I don't want to throw you under the bus here, but is there a reason that it refers to only relevant clusters as opposed to all clusters? And I ask this question because in my mind, all clusters are relevant to build stronger relationships with local OPDs. I don't know if while everyone is reading and still filling out the survey, if it would be all right if I pose that question to you. Over.
No, thank you, Kim. I mean, that's a well spotted typo. I mean, the key message that we want to put forward on this whole process is that you shouldn't, segregate and park disability inclusion in any particular place. It should be something that's mainstreamed across all the clusters, of course.
While we're waiting, I'm just looking through the chat, and Pedro, I'll note that I'm just trying to upload some links to some resources that are focused on providing some insights, or dare I say guidance on primary data collection in our new normal or our current normal in COVID-19. So that will be coming through. And I see that you also added a comment which is very interesting. I'd recommend what we did here that worked well is to immediately form a disability working group or disability subcluster composed of DPOs and INGOs working in the disability area, experts in inclusion, etc. This facilitates sort of, the intercluster interactions, working collaboratively together to support inclusion, and a fora through which to advocate for disability inclusion more widely. I know some similar approaches have been taken by gender experts. I'm thinking notably of OPD. I just heard a presentation about that yesterday, and it did pique my interest in seeing if something similar for disabilities might be feasible. So interesting note. Interesting note there. Thank you for sharing that experience and those insights. Over.
Kim, at what point do we want to come back and discuss the three options? Do you have a thought on this?
I think we can come back.
I think you're
Yes,
good. It looks like you've got 35 responses there, so that's a
36, and it's
oh, there you
overwhelming.
go. There you go. And yeah, and I think there's a clear winner in this one. I don't think that distribution is going to change considerably.
Yeah, I hope, as in all elections, let's hope that on voting day, it's the clear distribution is clear. So let's look at the least favored option first. That's the 19.4. Encourage relevant clusters, e.g., health and protection. Relevant clusters. You caught me out on that one, Kim, on that. To build stronger relationships with local OPDs. In terms of the consequences, there's a few that we could imagine right away. Sometimes it's hard to form relationships with local organizations for cluster coordinators who come into a humanitarian situation and are briefed on all of the complexity and are thrown immediately into the workload, and sometimes have a hard time getting outside the office to figure out who's out there in terms of civil society. Often what they also find when the cluster teams look outside, they see organizations of persons with disabilities. They look at the capacity that they have, the kinds of discussions they join, and they're not that encouraged by the capacity that they have. And so they look to more articulate organizations to involve in their decision making. And sometimes, especially with this, and you caught me out in terms of how we phrase this, Kim, there's a risk of, you could say, what's the word I'm looking for? Parking disability and making it a particular cluster's problem. And that's not the message at all. I mean, it's what we would like to see is that disability is more mainstreamed across all the clusters, so that everybody begins thinking about it in terms of their activities and the decisions that they make. So option 2, there's no right answer or wrong answer, but in this case, there seems to be some particular issues. The blue slice of the pie, if everybody can see that, that's option 1, and the choice that the HC was thinking about with that one was to identify a particular local organization of persons with disabilities within the community, and to offer them a permanent seat at the table. And that's an approach that's got some advantages to doing that. One is that the organization that you choose begins to engage. They understand what the issues are. They meet the relevant personalities. There's some real strong advantages of continuity. There's another advantage in terms of raising the profile, giving persons with disabilities and their organizations a louder voice in the discussions. As the HCT meets and deliberates and tries to set priorities, if you have a permanent seat in that discussion, you can offer a higher profile to the issue of disability. Another good thing to come out of that would be just the mechanisms of running these meetings. If you're going to offer an organization of persons with disabilities a seat in that table, you've got to make the table accessible. And so that there are some advantages there in terms of helping the HCT think through some of the access issues, just in terms of simply logistics sometimes. An issue with that, though, and we've seen in examples where HCTs have taken this approach, is that there is a risk of it being taken as a kind of token representation. So that a organization of persons with disabilities is always at the meeting, but people marginalize their voice because they always seem to talk about the same kinds of issues. So there is a risk, depending on the personalities involved and the organizations involved, that this risks being a sort of kind of token representation. And finally, and I think this is a really important issue as well, many communities, humanitarian response communities, we see politics, who who gets invited and who doesn't get invited becomes a very political issue within the humanitarian country team. And you risk that organization that's invited it makes it a kind of difficult process to be representative of all organizations of persons with disabilities, but that, you know, it makes it a harder job for them. And so politics is something to take and keep in mind when offering a sort of a permanent seat for organizations of persons with disabilities on that kind of high-level decision-making forum. The most popular choice, 58.3% of responses, said that maybe what we should be doing is strengthening the capacity of organizations of persons with disabilities to better engage in humanitarian action. And that's a popular option for a number of good reasons. In a way, the easiest way to get access to the community, the disability community, is through organizations that represent those people. And building stronger relationships with those organizations is a really good long-term strategy. One of the things that is observed is that local organizations of persons with disabilities often need their capacity built, just in terms of being able to engage, to have human resources able to sort of take part in meetings, to contribute to analysis, and so on. So there is a recognition that if you want to involve organizations of persons with disabilities, there's also going to need to be an investment in strengthening their capacity. One of the issues that could come about as a result of that is that within the humanitarian response, there might not be the kinds of resources that are required to do this capacity building. And that's something that needs to be bumped up to a higher level and given greater visibility. Because if you want these smaller, sometimes less capacitated local organizations to take part, they're going to somehow need the wherewithal, ability, and resources to do that. A third sort of issue of consideration is that, and this is just sort of an issue, in humanitarian response, it's often a very short-term issue. We're looking at the immediate issue in front of us, and often we're not looking at the longer term. And sometimes the capacity building process is a longer term process that can't be solved immediately. So with option number 3, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is how much appetite is there for sort of a longer term engagement in that area. So thanks. I mean, that was the option that the majority by far chose, and I think that's a good choice as well. So thanks. I think you're going to move over now. Who's going to moderate this? I think it's you, Kim, that is going to moderate a question and answer discussion. And Ahmed, you have some questions already.
It is. I do get to moderate. We have about 15 minutes left, and there are a few questions and points that arose in the chat that have not yet been addressed. So perhaps I'll start with those and then move on to others that arise, of course, and a couple that we had thought about in advance that we wanted to pose to the group if time allowed us to do so. So one of the more recent comments is who is really interested in developing capacities of persons with disabilities during a humanitarian situation? You know, I don't think that, perhaps maybe a little bit cynical, but probably not completely off base. I would argue, and Ahmed and Steve may wish to supplement or disagree, that we have a unique opportunity right now as a result of COVID. There is increased recognition of the criticality, the important role that localization plays in the humanitarian response. Of course, it's something that we've been hearing about for years, but given restricted access, limited international staff movements, the critical and central role that localized organizations and communities play in providing and being the first layer of the humanitarian response, I think has been particularly highlighted and become starkly apparent. So I think this is an opportunity for us to utilize that and to try to increase focus on capacity building with a specific focus on disability organizations. But I understand. I'm saying that as my view of an opportunity that currently exists, and others may have different views. So maybe I'll throw that out there for others to comment on. Yeah, with that, over.
Thank you for comment, Pedro. I think it's very important. You have also another question about intellectual disability and how they could, a very straightforward answer for intellectual disability is about representation. Most of the time, person with intellectual disability could represent themselves, but most of the time, their family is representing them. So don't forget, the family of person with disability should be involved also in all consultation. This is one of the biggest added value for this, because they are the one who is usually provide care and the one that can represent person with disability. In some very rare occasion, you can find an organization for person with disability with intellectual disability. It's very rare, and most of the time the family is representing them. So we need to consider that in practical way until. Regarding the capacity building of person with disability organization, it's a very new concept that is happening in humanitarian context. Yes, I agree with you. It haven't not been done in the previous, but now with two concepts is emerging now, localization, and we have been pushed to localization because of the COVID. International organizations have difficulty access to the humanitarian context because of the COVID situation. So they have to depend on local organization, and we need to ensure that part of this local organization is organization of persons with disability. This is one. The second, that short-term and long-term capacities. As Steve was saying, one of the problems that most of the humanitarian cycle program is 1 year. And we all know that the capacity building for organization take much longer. So it started to inject the capacity building in a small, short-term work within the humanitarian cycle, the 1 year, and then try to work with the local organization to make it accumulated to long term. So it's a small step in the beginning, then a long step for the future. Do you have another question, Kim?
There was a comment or a concern about data sharing by international NGOs, which can certainly be a problem. I'll note that the Center for Humanitarian Data, which is based in The Hague, is working with UN agencies and local and international NGOs, as well as governments, to try and procure as much data, both disability specific and more generally, to have sort of an online repository. And one of the benefits of their approach is they are able to also anonymize that data, so that concerns over data security can be addressed in an effective way. Related to that, they are working again with UN agencies and INGOs on some interagency standing committee guidance on data security and data responsibilities, which is also aimed at one of its aims, not its sole aim, is to encourage and to create a space so that data sharing is made more is facilitated, and also but facilitated in a safe and secure manner. So the hope is that that we can take forward movement on that. I'm seeing a question from Lama, a question about emergency response. She works in nutrition. How can the response be inclusive of persons with disabilities in emergencies when we don't have time to conduct assessments? What's the quickest way for them to be left, not to be left behind, for example, during general food distribution? And I'm seeing some comments coming in about that, about field surveys and screening methods. I don't know, Ahmed, Steve, if you have additional insights that you might wish to share. Over.
I think it's very important to understand that in any emergency response, we always have data collection, whatever the situation, except in very, very limited situation, we always do a nutrition, for example, response analysis. We do nutrition need overview. we do a lot of data collection. Only thing that we are asking is including disability inside this data collection. So this is the first step. Even in case that you don't have any data collection that will happen or any conduct assessment that will happen, and as I said, this is very rare, you should consult with the key informant and person with disability existing on the community to ask them about their need, their priority, what kind of barriers that they are facing to reach you to your services. And in this case, I will strongly advise to use the accessibility, affordability, accountability, and acceptability framework. It's a very famous one. I can send you the link. That is it's very helpful in analyze to which extent person with disability can access to specific service, especially in nutrition. Then in your monitoring framework, you should include some disaggregated data by gender, disability, and age to understand if you are really reaching to this group or not.
That's really helpful, and I see some of the comments coming through, Ahmad, which in my mind directly link to the question that you posed. And so we've had a lot of chat about the remote monitoring and remote assessments. So we would pose to the group, what challenges do you foresee with the use of remote monitoring and ensuring inclusion of persons with disabilities? I'm going to open that up for some comments on the chat.
I think Steve could be answering this question because this is a very important question.
Well, I was actually, thanks for that, Ahmed. I was going to go back to Lama Matar's question about nutrition and involvement of persons with disabilities just in distribution processes. I think that there's, in just the logistics design of how we do distribution, I think that field teams with some orientation can sort of look at how they plan to do that distribution through the lens of accessibility for persons with disabilities, to try to sort of see whether the distribution point is accessible. You know, if it's in the middle of a large area where it's been raining for days and it's very difficult to even walk across it, there's going to be accessibility challenges for persons with mobility limitations, for example. So I think in just scratching the surface of the question, there are some things that we can do just in terms of logistics planning to make things more accessible. The other question was in terms of, can you remind me, Kim, it was a data collection issue?
Yeah, challenges to data collection and remote monitoring.
Well, this is where my mind is coming around is this is a particular niche where if you have developed relationships with organizations of persons with disabilities, they can help you in this. Because often I think I see in the chat, you know, it's hard to get data if people are hiding. And that's true. If you're working with organizations that have access somehow into that community, however, you have a bit of a window that you can use to find out what the particular issues, what the particular barriers, what the particular risks are. There was a really interesting recent rapid needs assessment that was done in South Sudan, where the study was built around working with local organizations of persons with disabilities who could provide a list of key informants to the data collectors, and they could help bridge sort of getting inside those communities and those households where persons with disabilities were, and they could help facilitate even the interview and the conversation in a socially distanced kind of way. It's an area that I'm really interested in particular the COVID context, is that it's already difficult to access persons with disabilities and get them to participate. The overlay of the social distancing restrictions that we have makes it even more complicated. And in my mind, that's where organizations of persons with disabilities, if you have those relationships, can really help make that bridge. Over.
Thanks a lot for that, Steve. I'm just quickly going through the chat to see if there's anything. There's certainly comments about the different barriers to accessing individuals with disabilities and how those are heightened. Very, very interesting chats coming through. So I think we have time for one last quick question, and it does hark back to the question I posed to you during the second scenario. So what do you think the role of different clusters beyond the protection cluster, and of course beyond the health cluster, the two that are most frequently cited or highlighted when we're talking about disability inclusion? What is the role of the other clusters, the different clusters, in supporting data collection and analysis on disability inclusion? I'm gonna throw that to both of you, Ahmed and Steve, while also keeping an eye on the chat to look for other inputs. Over.
Thank you, Kim. I will start, and then I think Steve also could add it on. I think it's very important during the working in disability to ensure that disability is not only a protection issue or health issue, because this is what I have seen during the review in HNO HRP, although it have been improved last year, but usually it have been seen disability as issue of protection and health. Disability is a cross-cutting issue that is covering all kind of sector and all kind of cluster. And we need to ensure that when we work on that, that we have understanding in every cluster how the crisis is impact differently person's ability, as we was discussing in nutrition, for example, and in protection, in health, in even camp coordination, all that ensure that at least all the cluster is doing this analysis inside their cluster and inside their work. This is one, but also during the way that we are the cluster is forming their result and the change that is hoping to achieve, we should ensure that the sectoral objective and response, or the cluster objective and response, can address the factor that is contributing to the barriers that we was analyzing about personal disability. So it's a common accountability that is covering all cluster. Cluster also could play a huge role in data collection, because most of the data collection happen in humanitarian situation is happening at cluster level. And most of the cluster have their own data collection that is focusing in nutrition, focusing on protection, focusing in education. And if we succeeded to include disability question inside Washington Group question inside this data, and include analysis question inside this analysis tool, we will have a plenty of data that could serve the overall planning for inclusion of disability in humanitarian action. Steve, could you please step in?
Yeah, a little bit of addition to that. Thanks, Ahmed. I think that's very comprehensive. I looked closely at one of the HNOs, humanitarian needs overviews, last year, and where they had done a multi-sector needs assessment survey, a big household survey that was disaggregated by disability. And what we found as they did that analysis is that the sort of the implications and the insights that they got out of that multi-cluster needs assessment was actually not just one sector. Because it was disaggregated, you could sort of look at the implications in all the different sectors that were covered by that survey. And what I think is really important is that once that analysis is done, that there's a bit of self-reflection and interrogation by the clusters to say, well, what is the, what should we be thinking about in terms of disability inclusion given the results of that survey? So in that particular example that I'm thinking about, they did a really good needs assessment, but they didn't actually connect the dot to the planning side. And so it was just a few of the clusters that actually dug deeper and began to think through what the implications were, and they made a plan that was more disability inclusive. So I think that that's not really an answer to the question, but when you do these integrated cluster surveys that involve big numbers of households, and you do it in a disability disaggregated way, there's a rich amount of data that can come out of that to help inform the thinking in all of the clusters, not just the usual suspects. If that helps. Over to you, Kim.
Thanks a lot. And we are at the end of the time that we have allocated. I would encourage everyone to just take a quick look before we do sign off to the chat where Ahmed has posted some helpful resources. I would like to take the opportunity to thank both Ahmed and Steve for their facilitation today and also all the time they put into developing the content and creating an interesting and creative way to address some of these questions when we are all spending an enormous amounts of time online and in web access. I kindly ask you to take a short session feedback quiz, which has also been posted within the chat box. And keep your eye out. We will post the recording of this session as well as the PowerPoint presentation. We'll make those available to you. As always, if you have any questions, we would encourage you to reach out to Ahmed, Steve, or I. We very much appreciate you taking time from your schedules to participate in this and work with us. With that, I thank you and I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. Over to you. Bye-bye.